been joined by our friends on Facebook. So we'll be starting this very important press conference to talk about the details of the torture and captivity of Hotel Rwanda humanitarian Paul Rusesabagina. At the end of the statements from the lawyers and from Paul's family, we will open the press conference up to questions from the media. At the bottom of your screen, there's a function called Q&A. Please put any questions that you have in the Q&A function. You can add them there during the press conference, and we'll address all of the questions at the end of the press conference. And now I would like to introduce Brian Endless. Professor Brian Endless, please get us started.
Thank you very much, Kitty, and thank you all for joining us. As Kitty said, my name is Brian Endless. I've been a senior advisor to Paul and his foundation for over 15 years now, and have been working closely with the family since he was taken into captivity in Rwanda. It's been 264 days since Paul Rusesabagina was kidnapped and brought to Rwanda last August 27th. We're here today with Paul's legal team and family to share some extremely disturbing news. We always knew that Paul's captivity had the earmarks of torture, but until now, we have not been able to talk with him about it. Now Paul is speaking out, and he has confirmed both some details of his kidnapping and that during his first 4 days in prison, he was tortured by Rwandan authorities. This is a fairly unique circumstance. It is incredibly rare for someone who is still in prison to talk about the torture that they endured. That being said, Paul now believes that it is clear that the Rwandan system is not going to stop its illegal treatment and unfair trial, and he is at a point where his bravery has outweighed his fear of what might still happen. All of this has led to the decision to make his treatment public. I'm going to provide some of the details of the torture Paul endured, and then his lawyers and family will provide the legal and personal context. At the end of August, Paul Rusesabagina was kidnapped from his home in the United States, where he was lured to Dubai and then on to Rwanda. The final leg of that kidnapping was a game jet flight that was supposed to be going from Dubai to Burundi. That's what Paul thought. He was actually drugged on the plane. When he woke up, they were landing, and he realized that it was the Kigali control tower in Rwanda. Rwandan agents came onto the plane, they tied him up, and they dragged him off the plane. He was tied with his legs and arms, and he was blindfolded. As the agents came on, he screamed for help, hoping that someone would hear, and the flight crew did nothing except for the captain wishing him good luck as he was dragged off of the plane. Paul was taken by car. He was thrown into the back of a car and held in an unknown location for the first 4 days of his captivity. Paul has described this location as an abattoir in French, a slaughterhouse in English. He heard the screams of other prisoners, including women, and they would go on until they suddenly stopped. Paul was deprived of food and sleep. He was tied up and blindfolded the entire time in what were very likely stress positions from his description. Paul could not stand himself. He had to be held up and carried to the toilet and held upright to defecate. He frequently had his nose and or mouth covered, sometimes both at the same time. In one of the most disturbing incidents, he described jolting awake to realize that, still bound, arms and legs, his nose and mouth were both covered and he couldn't breathe. They only removed his gag slightly when his legs started shaking because of lack of oxygen, a sign of his last breaths. Also, while tied, he was put on the ground, gagged, and his torturer stood over him, military boot pinning him down on the nape of the neck until he could not breathe. They never asked him questions during those 4 days. This was not an interrogation. It was torture. They only took off his blindfold once during those 4 days, and that was when the prosecutor general and the director of the Rwandan Investigation Bureau, two of the highest level people in the Rwandan government, came in to tell him to sign a false confession. They wanted him to say the president of Zambia had sent him money to use for rebels. Paul delayed them and did not sign. Finally, we know that Paul was in solitary confinement for most of his first 260 days in prison, a situation that was only rectified last week. This is a direct violation of the Nelson Mandela rules, international standards for the treatment of prisoners. These rules explicitly describe anything over 15 days in solitary confinement as torture. This is only what happened to Paul during his first 4 days, and we've still not been able to get full details of his treatment since that time. All calls to him are monitored. He's limited in what he can say. His family only talks to him for 5 minutes a week, and his Rwandan lawyers have heavy and increasing restrictions on their interactions with Paul. The bottom line is that Paul Rusesabagina was kidnapped and then tortured. This is illegal under Rwandan and international law. This is a gross violation of Paul's rights and of international human rights. Paul's life, his health, and his safety are in danger every day he remains in Rwanda, and this must not be allowed to stand. At this time, to talk about the situation with Paul's lawyers, I'd like to turn the floor over to Paul's lead attorney, Kate Gibson. Kate?
Thank you very much, Brian. The treatment that Paul suffered between the 27th and the 31st of August last year is, in fact, part of a larger story. Paul's rights have been systematically violated from the moment of his kidnap up until today. Part of the act of torture is silencing the victim. And one of the most effective ways of doing this to a detainee is to restrict access to his lawyers, preventing him from being able to talk confidentially and in a privileged manner with people who can help him, with people who can provide him with advice and representation. I think it's well known that in this case, since December last year, all of the documents that Paul's lawyers in Rwanda have been given to him have been confiscated from Paul and read by the Rwandan authorities. But since the 23rd of April, this confiscation of documents has extended back to the members of his legal team itself in Kigali. And on that date, his lawyers were told that there were new rules in place for visits to Mr. Rusesabagina in prison, and they would not be allowed to take any documents into their meetings unless those documents were first read in full by the prison authorities. These new rules, of course, applied only to Paul. None of the other detainees in the prison where he's being housed are subjected to them. And this, in fact, is part of a larger pattern. Those of us who have worked in and around the Rwandan legal system and judicial system for 15, and in the case of Philippe, 20 years, can see that with Paul, the rules appear to have been changed. In other cases, accused were allowed to be represented by lawyers from the Bar of England and Wales, from the United States, from Kenya, from Cameroon, from the Netherlands. With Paul, the rules have changed. Other, even high-profile political detainees were allowed to have privileged and confidential conversations with their lawyers. With Paul, the rules have changed. In other cases, accused were allowed to have access to the case files against them, including lists of witnesses who were being called to testify in the case. Even when Paul was participating in the trial against him, it was being run as a trial by ambush, with no prior notice being given to Paul or his lawyers of who the next witness would be to walk into the courtroom and start to accuse him. And these violations have been systematic. Even yesterday, when a member of our legal team went to try to visit Paul, he had in his possession a document that was marked privileged and confidential, do not confiscate. It was taken from him and only returned to him at the end of his visit. I think I'll stop there because I really want to give some time now to the members of Paul's family to talk to you more about the impact of the torture on them and on Paul.
Trezor, if you can let us know your perspective on what's happening with your dad.
Hi, my name is Choharis and Philippe. I'm Paul's son. I think the best way to show you what's really going on is to read, to tell you exactly what my dad said himself, his own words, and I'll do that. These are his own words. So here he's talking about that slaughterhouse that Brian was talking about. He said, "I call that place the slaughterhouse. Them, they could call it as they wish, but me, I call it the slaughterhouse. Slaughterhouse. At that place, I could hear people, women screaming, shouting, calling for help. And then he quotes them. He says, 'Please help, help, help.' And one could hear a loud voice becoming gradually lower and lower until it went off. And so to me, this hit me because it feels like this is where my dad is, literally and figuratively. He is that person right now, screaming, help, help, help. I just want to know who's going to show up. So here, Dad talks about being tied up. He said, even when you're in deep sleep and dreaming, they bring metals. They tie your arms. They tie your legs. They blind you. They tie your nose, your mouth, your ears. At that time, you immediately wake up. Me, I woke up, but I lacked strength because I was not sleeping. I lacked strength. And then when I lacked strength, I was suffocating. I could not move my arms. My legs were tied, and I could only move them a little bit, as if I was dying. And when I moved my legs, a person named Michelle untied my mouth so that I could breathe. And then I was able to breathe. Michelle, his name. So the third one that I want to read here, the last one, is Dad talking about being tortured. This is not easy for anybody to read, but here I go. He said, between the 27th and the 31st of August, during that period, I was being tortured. You cannot, therefore, be unconscious. You cannot be unconscious while being tortured unless they administer you drugs. During that period, I was really not used to sleeping. And this is my dad talking. What he's really saying is I wasn't sleeping. And the day that they took me there on the 28th, the day that I arrived there in the morning, I remember that man, Michelle Banzawagabo. Michelle, again. Michelle was wearing military boots. That stayed in my mind because he stepped on my neck with those boots. He stepped with those boots on my... I could hear him telling me as I was laying down, my legs tied, my arms tied on the waist, my nose tied. I was breathing through my mouth. I was harshly breathing. And I could hear him telling me, us, we know how to torture. We know how to torture. So now just imagine this is your father. It's all I have to say. Just imagine this is your father. And if you don't have a father, imagine it's your grandfather. Because my dad was also a grandfather. If you don't have a grandfather, imagine someone that you love, someone that was there for you every step of the way. And not just you, but imagine this man was there. Every time you heard somebody cry for help, that man was there. Now that's the same man that's saying that he needs help. And this man, Michel, yeah, I'm saying his name because Dad said his name, so I'm saying his name, Michel. He is the so-called man that tied up a 66-year-old man, that blinded him, tied up his arms, his legs, nose, mouth, so he couldn't breathe, or could breathe just a little bit. This is that same coward we're talking about. He's just one of a few. But I just wanted to let you know that this is what we're going through. And I hope that, that somebody steps up. That's all I can say. And I just wanted to ask you guys to imagine if this was your own father. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Trezor. That's just insanely hard to do, and we really appreciate it. This is, all of us who work with the family know, this is what the family is going through. This is what we had to read when word came from Dad and we found out what was actually happening and how insanely difficult this is. And people do need to think of it as if it's their parent or their grandparent. Thank you for pointing that out, because that's what torture is. Peter Choharis, you've been working with the legal team on the United States side. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that and about how people can help and what we need. You're on mute, Peter. You're on mute, Peter.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Trezor, for talking about your dad. So it's very difficult to hear, but one of the jobs we have as lawyers is to help people fight back. I first want to congratulate Paul's local counsel, our Rwandan colleagues, who have shown tremendous courage in helping bringing this information and this news public, and also Paul himself. This was a great act of courage. Brian is right. Most often people either can't or have too much fear to make these kinds of events, traumas that they experience public, especially when they're still in captivity and still quite vulnerable. So I just want to salute both Paul and our local counsel in Rwanda for allowing us and helping us to fight back. And that's what we did early this morning. My co-counsel, Kate Gibson, Philippe La Rochelle, and myself filed a urgent appeal with the UN Special Rapporteur on torture. In addition, my law firm, my colleague Mohammed Bakash and I, along with the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization, filed a request for urgent action from the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. And both of those, in sum and substance, were very similar. We did a number of things. We updated both of them. We'd already filed petitions with both of them previously, but we updated them. Certainly alerted them to the torture and inhumane and degrading treatment that Paul experienced in the slaughterhouse that Brian described and that Trezor read parts of a memorialization of what took place from Paul. In addition, we told him about the more than 260 days of solitary confinement, which mercifully just ended last week. A quick side note on that, the Mandela rules are not hallowed in the same way as the convention and other prohibitions against torture. But the 260 days is excessive by any measure, and in this case was completely unwarranted. Paul does have, and I won't, I think some of our local council and others might go into detail, new cellmates, but we recognize that that also poses somewhat of a risk for Paul, both physically as well as in terms of a bogus jailhouse confession. Many times, these are mechanisms by which regimes can try to trap somebody into saying something or not saying something at all, but claiming somebody said something. So we're aware of that. We recognize the risk, but given the deprivation of human contact for more than 260 days, we welcome what's taken place, even as we have no idea who his fellow cellmates are, what their background is, why they're in jail, and whether they pose a physical or other risk to him. But let me continue. We also will let the working group and the special rapporteur know that the ongoing deprivations with both Paul's medicines, access to medicines, and medical care of a physician of his choosing. And remember, he is a 66-year-old cancer survivor. He has several chronic conditions, including hypertension. We described those in details in the original petitions. And the man, just as we learned recently at the very start of his incarceration 260 days ago, went through enormous physical and emotional suffering, which have never been properly treated or examined by a physician, as far as we're aware. So the bottom line, and since then we've done a couple of things. In addition to filing those two petitions, I've debriefed members of the State Department, as well as begun debriefing key Senate staff. I expect that we'll be debriefing key staff in both the House and Senate. And the situation, I'll close with this observation. The situation we find ourselves now in is that under American law, I want to be clear about this because in the press, and even some of us have spoken about he was kidnapped from Dubai. That is not accurate. He was kidnapped from the United States. They violated U.S. kidnapping statute, and both President Kagame and the Minister of Justice in television interviews admitted to a conspiracy to kidnap. So that's very important. We've got somebody who was kidnapped from the United States, who was tortured and now has been deprived of a fair trial. So we're calling, obviously, on the State Department and European governments to demand Paul's immediate release and to join the U.S. Congress, who months ago, 35 leaders in of the foreign policy committees in both the House and Senate, bicameral, bipartisan, called for Paul's immediate release. And we think today's information warrants that the United States State Department take that position as well. And let me turn it back over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Peter. We appreciate it. I want to take a few minutes now and ask if we can briefly switch to French. We have many people following this case in Belgium, where Paul is also a citizen, and in the EU. And I'd like to ask another of our councils, Philippe Larochelle, to cover the highlights of what we're talking about in French, if you could, please. Philippe.
Oui, merci, Brian. Donc, nous avons entendu, je voudrais remercier Trésor qui nous a livré les détails troublants de la façon dont Paul a été torturé après son enlèvement par les autorités rwandaises. Je crois que ça prend beaucoup de courage à la fois à Trésor et à la fois à Paul aussi de nous livrer les détails de ce qui s'est passé après son enlèvement. Voilà un homme décoré de la médaille présidentielle de la liberté, enlevé en toute impunité par les Rwandais il y a maintenant 260 jours et qui croupit toujours encore aujourd'hui dans une prison rwandaise sans que sa situation ne semble vouloir s'améliorer. Donc, j'aimerais rappeler les détails tout de même que Trésor nous a livrés, donc d'avoir été aveuglé, d'avoir été, on lui a pilé sur la gorge avec la botte. On n'a aucune information sauf ce qui nous a été livré par Paul sur ce qui s'est passé après qu'il a été enlevé par les autorités rwandaises. On n'a pas, jamais on ne voit ça. Une personne qui est arrêtée, on a un rapport détaillé des endroits où ils sont détenus, des endroits, des gens qui en ont la responsabilité. En fait, il est disparu et on l'a enlevé et on l'a fait disparaître. Pourquoi? Pour pouvoir éventuellement, ce qu'on a appris, pour pouvoir tenter de lui faire signer, après qu'il a été enlevé, après qu'il a été torturé de la plus odieuse façon, de lui faire signer une confession où il aurait admis les crimes imaginaires qu'on tente aujourd'hui de lui faire porter à travers un procès truqué de toutes parts. Donc, certains pourront se demander pourquoi ces détails ne sont révélés que maintenant, pourquoi nous n'apprenons qu'à ce jour les détails de la façon dont Paul a été torturé. Il y a une chose très importante que Kate a mentionnée, c'est qu'il est enlevé contre son gré. On le fait disparaître et on le torture de la façon qui a été décrite partiellement par Trésor. Et que fait-on après? Dans ce scénario, on lui donne des avocats contre son gré. On lui donne des avocats qui ne sont pas indépendants, qui n'ont pas la liberté et la capacité de représenter, qui n'ont jamais, pour toutes les semaines où ces deux avocats ont représenté M. Rusesabagina, jamais la question de l'enlèvement ou de la torture n'a été soulevée devant le juge. Donc, vous voyez la complicité et surtout la complaisance des avocats qui sont supposés faire valoir les intérêts de leurs clients, qui ici étaient complaisants à l'égard du régime et qui ont évité de soulever les questions difficiles et qui mènent aujourd'hui au fait que les détails relatifs à la torture que Paul a endurée ne nous ont été révélés que plus tard. Que se passe-t-il par la suite? Même une fois qu'il a pu choisir ses avocats, ceux-ci, vous l'avez entendu, n'ont pas la liberté de pouvoir travailler avec leurs clients, n'ont pas accès au dossier, se font confisquer des documents confidentiels et privilégiés à propos desquels ils veulent discuter avec leurs clients. Donc, dans quelles conditions, réellement, même une fois qu'il a pu avoir un mot à dire sur les gens qui le représentent, dans quelles conditions ce travail s'effectue-t-il? Et encore aujourd'hui, encore une fois, comme l'a souligné Maître Kate Gibson, on lui refuse les avocats, donc Maître Choharis, Maître Gibson et moi-même, donc les avocats qu'il veut avoir, qu'il demande et qu'il réclame pour pouvoir le représenter. Donc, le fait que le régime rwandais puisse agir en toute impunité, en enlevant, en torturant et en faisant subir des procès truqués à des gens comme aussi importants et aussi influents que M. Rusesabagina montre la pression et la peur qu'il a dû vivre du fond de sa geôle où il était emprisonné. Donc, ne cherchons pas ailleurs les raisons qui ont fait en sorte que, devant ces difficultés de représentation, devant l'impudence et l'impunité avec lesquelles le régime rwandais a agi jusqu'à présent pour violer de la manière la plus flagrante les droits les plus fondamentaux de M. Rusesabagina, qu'il a pris un certain temps avant que nous puissions avoir les détails de la façon dont il a été torturé. Encore hier, son avocat rwandais a tenté de lui apporter des documents privilégiés. Encore hier, les autorités de la prison ont confisqué le tout et empêché que son avocat puisse avoir une réelle séance de travail avec lui. La personne qui lui confisque les papiers à la prison où il est présent détenu est la même personne qui m'a empêché de voir mon client moi-même lorsque j'ai tenté, la dernière fois que j'étais au Rwanda. Donc, on peut voir, comme le soulignait, ça fait 20 ans que je travaille avec des clients qui sont au Rwanda, on peut voir une dégradation marquée de la façon dont les gens sont traités là-bas et on peut voir que les choses s'empirent puisque maintenant, on savait que le régime rwandais tuait des gens à l'étranger, c'est bien documenté. On connaît les circonstances déplorables dans lesquelles la justice est rendue dans ce pays. Maintenant, le régime va encore plus loin en enlevant des citoyens belges sans que la communauté internationale de réagisse. Il est grand temps que non seulement les États-Unis, comme le souligne Maître Choharis, mais le reste de la communauté internationale, en particulier la Belgique, dont certaines personnes nous entretiendront par la suite, prennent des moyens pour faire cesser ces violations répétées du droit par les autorités rwandaises. Je vous remercie. Donc, je vous redonne la parole, M. Endless.
Thank you very much, Philippe. We now want to turn back to the family and have three of Paul's daughters close this out.
Brian, excuse me for just a second. Philippe, there were a couple of things that you said in French that I think are very important to say in English for our English-speaking audience, especially the parts about how differently Paul has been treated.
What I was saying is that I've been working with people in Rwanda for the last 20 years, and now I'm involved in the case of Mr. Rusesabagina. And what I find by being involved in this case is things are worsening, that the regime seems now to be acting in full impunity by kidnapping. We knew they were killing abroad. We knew they were spying abroad. There's been multiple reports coming from the UK, from Australia, from Canada, where the Rwandan regime is at full force in trying to silence dissenting voice. But they've never been as far as kidnapping people. They have actually, but not people with the medals, genocide heroes such as Mr. Rusesabagina. People have been kidnapped in Uganda. There's been cases like that are documented. But what I see, and the fact that I'm now involved in the Rusesabagina case has actually degraded things for my other cases, where now I've been deprived of access to other clients I have in Rwanda only after I started getting involved in the case of Mr. Rusesabagina. So what I'm seeing is from my own experience and from the work that I've been doing in the past in Rwanda, I can see that conditions there are degrading and not improving. That was I said in French.
Thank you, Philippe. Incredibly important. Lise Rusesabagina is Paul's oldest daughter. Lise, again, in French, for the European French-speaking audience, if you can just give us a brief feel for what the family is thinking and feeling now.
Yes, thank you, Brian. La famille reste en souffrance, on reste choqué, on reste chagriné par les tortures que notre père a dû endurer. Il a subi des atrocités, mais on reste quand même très fiers de lui parce que pendant ces 3 ou 4 jours où il est resté attaché des bras, des yeux, bandé des yeux, il a été attaché des mains, des pieds et partout, on lui a laissé souffler que 20 minutes tout simplement pour lui faire signer de fausses accusations. C'était le procureur de la République, Aimable Havugimana, et Janon Luhunga, qui est le directeur du RIB. On reste très fiers de lui parce qu'il a quand même dit non, même dans les moments les plus difficiles où il risquait sa vie, il a préféré rester un homme, un vrai homme, courageux, tel qu'on l'a toujours connu. Aujourd'hui, ça fait près de 9 mois qu'on est très inquiet quant à sa santé, parce que, comme vous le savez, il n'a toujours pas eu ses médicaments. Il reçoit des médicaments mal dosés, ce qui fait que sa tension ne peut jamais se stabiliser. Il est aujourd'hui avec 2 co-détenus. Ça nous laisse également très inquiets, car comme on connaît les Rwandais, ils peuvent le tuer ou même les tuer tous et faire croire qu'ils étaient en train de s'évader. Nous implorons encore une fois la communauté internationale, notamment la Belgique, on ne cessera jamais d'appeler à l'aide pour que la Belgique, les États-Unis et tout autre pays capable de l'aider à sortir de là puissent nous aider à le ramener soit en Belgique, soit aux États-Unis, parce que, comme nous le savons, il n'aura jamais de procès équitable tant qu'il sera sur le territoire rwandais et tant que le FPR restera au pouvoir, car, comme vous le savez, il est face à un procès digne d'une pièce de théâtre. Et voilà, merci.
Thank you very much, Lise. We know how hard it is on the family. Next, I'd like to turn to Paul's youngest daughter, Karine, who has been leading efforts in Europe. And if you can both give the family perspective and talk briefly about what we hope action can come out of Europe.
Yes, so thank you, Brian. So it's been 263 days that our father is in Rwanda. The Belgian government has yet to even call this a kidnapping. It's clear now that there was no legal extradition. It's clear that he was tortured. We now know he was tortured. We have details of the fair trial violations and all the human rights violations that he has faced since he arrived in Rwanda. Yet the Belgian government has yet to even call this a kidnapping. The Belgian government has yet to get him his medication. He has been there for 8 months now, and he does not have his medication. They have yet to demand his transfer from Rwanda to Belgium. They have not even demanded his transfer. It's very sad for us as a family and for anyone, really, any citizen of the world, to know that the body that is supposed to protect you, that's supposed to advocate for your rights, that's supposed to to come help you when you are in such a situation, is remaining silent. The silence is deafening, and it's painful for us as a family to watch this. And so we ask the Belgian government to take responsibility. We appreciate the remarks Minister Humus said to Minister Vincent Biruta a few weeks ago, asking for to respect our father's human rights, but that is not enough. That is not enough because our father is suffering and our family is suffering, and he is your responsibility as a citizen. I would also add that we know now that the EU Bar Federation, which consists of 1 million lawyers, 225 member bars and bar association, have also demanded the immediate release of our father. The US Congress, as Peter mentioned earlier, has demanded his immediate release. We are waiting for Belgium to demand his immediate release and return back home, because this has been taken too long, and it's painful and it's hurtful for our family, and we are frankly afraid for our father's life. That's it. Thank you very much, Karine. For our final words before we go to Q&A, I'd like to turn the floor over to Anais Kanimba, Paul's daughter, to talk about the American side of the perspective.
Thank you, Brian. And I'm not going to repeat everything everyone said already, but the sentiment is the same over here, what Karine said, and then also our legal team said as well. What we want and what we've been looking for from the United States government is really to also take a stand against this violation and this unacceptable torture, unacceptable violation of basic human rights, lack of defense, and the list goes on. And what is very clear now is that a fair trial is impossible when it started out of kidnapping and then torture. What we need is for the United States government, also the State Department, to also call for his release and to do everything they can to bring him back home safely to us. We miss him dearly. And lastly, I'd like to just highlight on some major events happening around the world, specifically right now in Rwanda. There is the NBA and the Ball Africa Ball that's just started a partnership. We're really happy about this partnership for the African continent. But we would like to call on the NBA to also rise their standards for human rights, just as they are here in the United States, and for social justice. What we've seen in Rwanda and what we've seen for my father is not only to my father. Many, many Rwandans are suffering from this system. Many Rwandans don't experience social justice. Many Rwandans have been tortured in the prison of Paul Kagame. And not only my father needs help, but others. So we call to action for the NBA and the Commonwealth of Head of States to all employ human rights to Kagame and to President Kagame before really wanting to move forward in Rwanda. But lastly, I think, really the State Department really needs to stand up against what we've learned.
Thank you very much, Anais, and everyone in the legal team and family. I'll now turn it back to Kitty and take us into the Q&A section.
Thank you, Brian. I'd just like to remind the journalists watching that you can put questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we will take all of them. The first question is from Jeffrey York at the Globe and Mail, and we've answered part of it in French, but I also want us to have the lawyers answer it in English because it's an incredibly important point. And the question is, it's actually a couple of questions, but can you explain why the full details of Paul's torture did not emerge until now? His conversations continue to be monitored, and he has limited access to his lawyers and family, but people may wonder why he didn't provide these torture details last September when he was first, last September. Why did he feel he able to disclose these details now and not before? Kate, maybe if you can start, and then Peter or Philippe, if you have something to add.
Thank you very much. It is an important question. It's important to remember that after Paul's kidnapping and the initial period of torture, he was assigned lawyers that weren't of his choosing. He wrote letters requesting that lawyers such as myself, Peter Choharis and Philippe La Rochelle on the call be assigned to his case. These requests were refused by the Rwandan Bar Association, and he was given 2 imposed lawyers who never raised the issue of his kidnapping, the circumstances of his arrival in Rwanda, or his treatment in detention in front of the judges. That was the first reason for the delay. And in addition to that, as a legal team, we've had these discussions, and I don't think any of us have ever come across an example before where someone who is still in detention, who is still being detained by the same regime that inflicted the torture, is brave enough, while still incarcerated, to give these kinds of details. So for me, the question isn't why hasn't it come out before? I'm overwhelmed by Paul's bravery in allowing us to make these details public, even at this point. I don't know if Peter or Philippe had anything to add.
Sure. So a couple of things. First, I want to be clear, because it's an important question, Jeffrey, that I don't believe that we know the full extent of the abuse that Paul suffered. I think there are a number of questions that I have that others might have in reading the memorialization of what took place. And I'm not surprised by that. First, there were limitations as a practical matter, as Kate mentioned, but there are also other limitations. As a general matter, we don't ask rape victims who are raped on a Thursday night, well, did you report it Friday morning? Did you report it at least by close of business Friday? And people coming back from wartime situations who have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, well, did you report it immediately? Did you go talk to somebody within that first week? Traumas of the type that Paul has experienced endure sometimes with people for years unreported. That's part of the tragedy of what happens here. People are taken into custody in police stations all over the world, are beaten, are sexually abused, raped, otherwise degraded and treated to inhumane treatment, never reported. So that is not uncommon. With respect to Paul, not only did he not have access to his attorneys of his choice for many weeks, but he was even deprived for extraordinary lengthy periods of time of a pencil and paper by which to even memorialize anything or communicate anything. And certainly there was no secure mechanism by which to transfer this information. So I've read the transcript several times. There are a couple of tells for why I think it's compelling and why I think, but also why I think it's incomplete. And it's not, and I do think Kate's point, and I made it earlier as well, it is extraordinary that while somebody is in custody, they actually name names. They name names of the torturer, the people who were there behind the physical abuse, and 2 people who were there, high-ranking officials, one from the Rwandan Investigation Bureau and one from Prosecutor General, who were asking questions. So that is an extraordinary thing in and of themselves. And I think your readers should understand that, Jeffrey. But thank you for the important question.
Thank you. Philippe, did you have anything to add, or do you feel like you were covered?
Just to add this, that, it started with the torture and conditions in which Paul must have been fearing for his life that this would happen again. And then appointed fake lawyers who would not denounce it and all, which would, I guess, strengthen his feeling of being powerless and not being able to denounce it. Then, even when he managed to get the lawyers of his choosing, the visits were very random, they were rare, there were restrictions. He never knew when he was going to see them again for the next time. So it took some time before he could gather the courage to actually come up with that, with the consequence, with the fear of being subjected again to the same kind of episodes and the same kind of torture that he suffered the first time around. So I think that goes a long way in explaining why there's a certain delay before these details could surface.
I think also, having worked with Paul for 15 years, I think that a lot of his hesitancy was also not only worry about himself, but worry about his attorneys and what would happen to his attorneys when he shared this information. I know Paul to be a man of great empathy and of great compassion for others, and I believe that part of his hesitancy was to shelter his lawyers. Our next question comes from Ivan Mugisha from Agence France Presse. And Karine, this question is for you. Can you talk about, have you asked the government of Belgium why they haven't presented him with his medicine, and what was their response?
So yes, we have asked, and actually they did. The Belgian government tried, they delivered his medication at the prison, and the prison authorities confiscated the medication and refused to give it to Dad, in the same way that they have systematically confiscated his privilege document, in the same way that they have systematically violated most of his basic human rights. They have taken his medication and instead give him other types of medication. So the Belgians tried, the Belgian government did try to bring the medication, but once it wasn't successful, they should not have stopped there and allowed this to continue. They should take other measures, more stronger measures, to ensure that at least his health is okay, and this has not happened yet.
Thank you, Karine. The next question is from Peter Verlinden. Which political support has the family been getting in Belgium? And if not specifically from the foreign ministry, maybe from parliamentarians, if you could talk to us a little bit about that, Karine.
Yes, so we have been speaking with many deputies and many members of parliament on Dad's case, and who have supported us and who are discussing now the resolution that has been introduced in the Belgian federal parliament. This resolution is hopefully would be debated in the upcoming weeks, but we are still gathering support. And the fact that now even parliamentarians are calling out the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, are challenging the ministers and the prime minister on their action, on what has actually, rather their inaction on our dad's case, is telling. So basically you have the European Union that condemned Rwanda, you have the EU Bar Federation that has demanded his immediate release, you have the United States Congress that has demanded his immediate release, the Balearic Islands Parliament has demanded his immediate release. All these countries around are taking strong actions, are making strong statements in support of our father and in favor of his human rights and for his immediate release. Yet the Belgian government itself hasn't yet to do so, but the parliamentarians are pushing and are advocating on our behalf. So there is support. We just need to continue to challenge and hope that the Belgian government itself takes stronger measures and takes responsibility for their citizens.
Thank you so much, Karine. The next question is from Steen from VRT. How did it, and it's a sensitive one, so I'm going to go first to Kate and then to Peter. How did you collect the testimonies from Mr. Rusesabagina about the torturing during phone calls with his family? ? Kate, if you can explain to the extent that we can explain.
Thanks very much, Kitty. Of course, in a perfect world, once Paul had written a letter designating us as part of his legal team, we would have been given access to him in the prison in Rwanda and been able to sit down with him from the very beginning and hopefully record in the form of notes any information that he wanted to share with us. We know that's not the reality for Paul. In relation to his conversations with the family, I think we also mentioned earlier that those are limited to 5 minutes every week on a Friday afternoon. And it's our understanding that they are also monitored. The way in which this information came to light was through a meeting between one of the members of our Rwandan legal team and Paul, a physical meeting in the prison itself. The details that Paul then shared with our lawyer have been written down and are annexed to our filings in front of both the UN Special Rapporteur for Torture and the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, both of which were filed today.
Thank you. Peter, did you have anything to add to that?
No, we allude, as Kate just mentioned, to how it was obtained in those two filings. I think we provided them to the press, and for safety reasons, I don't want to go into any greater detail than that.
Thank you very much. Another question from Peter Verlinden. Do we have a reaction on the statement of President Kagame yesterday in the interview, saying that he also wants a, quote, fair trial for Paul, and that fair trials are not to be defined by the US, the UK, Europe, or whatever? I will send that to you, Peter, but first I will ask the question that's maybe a rhetorical question. How can there ever be a fair trial that begins with a kidnapping? Peter?
Yeah, President Kagame is right in one sense. The UK and the US don't get to define what a fair trial is. The international law gets to define it, and the international community gets to define what's fair and what's not fair. And there are certain touch points about what's fair and what's not fair. Access to counsel of your choice, which he's been denied, international counsel, and all of us, Philippe, Kate, myself, have all served as international counsel in these kinds of cases in the past. The fact that we're unable to do so or even visit and communicate with our client is to us disturbing and a violation of his due process rights. What other rights have been violated? The attorney-client privilege, as Kate has mentioned, continues to be violated week after month, including as of yesterday. You cannot have a free and fair trial unless you're able to fully prepare for your trial and communicate with your counsel of choice. Even then, it took weeks, valuable weeks, that Paul was unable to have counsel of his own choice, even local Rwandan counsel. What else has due process violations have occurred? He hasn't had time to adequately prepare thousands of documents, yet the trial began before he was given any of them. What else has he been deprived of in terms of due process? Not able to prepare to cross-examine other witnesses, not able to prepare for his own defense, and not able even to have writing implements or a computer or some other documentation that's free from government confiscation for him to be able to swap information back and forth with his counsel. So on any fundamental level, there has been no due process. That issue is over. There has been no free and fair trial. We can't unscramble the egg. We can't suddenly wave a magic gavel and as of tomorrow, they'll start to have a free and fair trial. That issue is over. He's been deprived of a free and fair trial. And so it's nonsensical to talk about that now. It's done. They've already deprived him of his rights under international law, not under American law, not under UK law, but under international law that applies to Rwanda as well, including, I should add, several international instruments to which Rwanda, of its own free accord, joined, including the UN Convention on Torture, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which also set forth minimum standards of fairness in terms of criminal trials. Rwanda joined those conventions. Rwanda is violating those conventions. They chose to join them. They're violating international law, and the President and Minister of Justice should know that.
Thank you so much, Peter. Kate or Philippe, did you have anything that you wanted to add about the fair trial issue?
Just that another really important aspect of a fair trial is the presumption of innocence. And when you have high-level members of a regime repeatedly saying in the press that this detainee, this accused, will pay. He has blood on his hands. In the same breath yesterday, in the press conference being referenced, it was said he will have a fair trial, but by the way, he's a criminal. So those kinds of statements from high-ranking members of a regime have been held in many other cases to violate the presumption of innocence of an accused. And as Peter says, that is a bell that we can't ring.
Thank you so much, Kate. We're going to go to our last question, although I will also put out if anyone wants to add another question, we will keep answering, but I'm going to go to what is currently our last question. Brian, I'm going to ask you this, and then maybe you can wrap us up. Another question from Jeffrey York. And a last question just came in, so it's the penultimate question, Brian, not the ultimate question. Is your legal action against GainJet still ongoing in the US? Has GainJet responded yet to the court action with any statements, either outside the court or inside the court? Brian, please.
Thank you, Kitty. We have the GainJet lawsuit is still ongoing. We are currently at a point where we are just finalizing serving GainJet with the lawsuit. The issue is this is an international lawsuit because GainJet is based in Greece and it does take time to do service. After that, GainJet will have some time to respond. GainJet has said absolutely nothing in public about this. And one of the things that we will do immediately as soon as GainJet is served is file an amended lawsuit with this new information. Paul was incredibly clear on the fact that the GainJet pilot and the GainJet flight attendant knew that he was being taken to Kigali and lied to him about it. They told him that he was going to Burundi. They stood by while he was being tied up and taken off the plane in Kigali. These were all things that we believed were the case earlier, but we now have Paul's direct testimony about it. So we have not moved forward actively with the GainJet case, but we look forward to doing that in the very near future.
There's one other point that came up, Brian, that I want you to clarify briefly from Johan Swinnen. Rwandan authorities allege that Paul Rusesabagina did not relinquish his Rwandan nationality. Which arguments are put forward for stressing he has only one Belgian nationality? And if you could briefly take us through the nationality question.
Thank you, Kitty. This is both incredibly important and also not at all important to this case in a very interesting way. If Paul had committed some criminal act, his nationality shouldn't be particularly important. But the Rwandan government is stressing this. They're trying to say he is still a Rwandan. In fact, he is not. Paul Rusesabagina fled Rwanda fearing for his life in 1996. In 1999, he became a Belgian citizen. When Paul became a Belgian citizen, both Belgium and Rwanda had laws on their books saying that you may not be a dual citizen. In order for Paul to take Belgian citizenship, he had to renounce his Rwandan citizenship. He has mentioned this publicly on numerous occasions, that he renounced his Rwandan citizenship before accepting his Belgian citizenship. In Rwanda, he couldn't have been a dual citizen at that point in time. And Rwanda is now ignoring their previous laws. Those laws did not change until 2003, when both nations allowed dual citizenship. Rwanda is conveniently ignoring that and claiming that he is still a citizen. I apologize, I misspoke. He became a Belgian citizen in 2000, not 1999. But Rwanda is choosing to ignore the fact that when he became a Belgian citizen, he simply couldn't be both.
Thank you, Brian. I would like to go, we're wrapping up. I just want to go to Trezor, who would like to make a brief comment about President Kagame's interview, as well as, and then Anais, I'm going to go to you to close us out.
I just wanted to, I was just going to add to a question I think Peter Verlinden asked about President Kagame's comments on fair trial and the fact that fair trial are not something that the U.S. or that is defined by the U.S. or the U.K. What he's really trying to say is that You know, they're not going to tell us what to do, but nobody's ever said that. Nobody's ever made those comments. This is something that President Kagame likes to use. He likes to say this a lot, to use the West's so-called condescension against them, really. Basically what he's saying, you know, torture being bad is not something that Europe came up with or that the US came up with. It's just something that, as a, you know, a person, a human, knows torture is not good. The right to your own attorneys is not something that, you know, you only see in Europe or America. The right to your own attorney is literally a human right. It's literally a human right. So it's not something that, you know, Europe came up with only for Europe or, you know, the US. It's something that if you have a heart, if you're a human, you know. Months of solitary confinement for no reason. That's not something that, you know, Europe said it's bad, so it's bad. It's something that we all know it's bad. So this is just a strategy that he's always used to say the West this, the West that. And then, you know, while the West argues about, well, should we step in, should we not? Well, he goes on and kills more people. More people lose a father, more people lose an uncle while they're doing that. So please don't just disregard him saying that. That's just part of his strategy. You know, we're not talking about European rights or US rights. We're talking about human rights, and that goes for everybody.
Thank you, Trésor. And at the same time that he condescends the West about rights, he has his both hands out, accepting their donations and their money gratefully. Anais?
Yes, I would like to all of this has been kind of possible with the help of our lawyers in Kigali, Maître Rudakemna and Maître Félix Gatera. They've been really brave, and it's been very difficult also for them to be able to practice in the context that they're in, and with all the difficulties and all the violations that we've laid out. And so I just wanted to give them a shout out for all their support in helping my father, but also the shout out to our international lawyers here, Kate, Phil, and Peter, and Vincent, who've also done everything in their power to help our father come back. And also thank you to all of you who've been kind of with us and supporting us throughout this nightmare. We pray a lot for my father to be back very soon to us, and it's be with all of you and all your support that we will get that. So thank you again, and we wish you a good day.
Thank you so much, Anais. In Paul Rusesabagina's book, An Ordinary Man, he talks very eloquently about what happened during the genocide and about how every night he wrote and faxed and called out to the international community and asked them to stop the killing and to stop the genocide, and the international community was silent. Once again, Paul Rusesabagina is crying out, asking for the help of the international community. I call upon the international community to wake up and talk and shout and give him his rights and demand his immediate release. Thank you very much.